أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه، ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له، ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن سيدنا محمدًا عبده ورسوله ونبيه وصفيه وحبيبه، بلغ الرسالة وأدى الأمانة ونصح للأمة، وجاهد في سبيل الله حتى أتاه اليقين، وتركنا على المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك. فاللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الأولين، وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الآخرين، وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الملأ الأعلى إلى يوم الدين، وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في كل وقت وحين، وعلى آله الأطهار، وعلى أصحابه الأخيار، وعلى أتباعه الأبرار إلى يوم الدين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة، وخلق منها زوجها، وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء، واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم، ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. وبعد، فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله، وإن خير الهدي هدي سيدنا ومولانا رسول الله، وإن وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. Many people ask about music. So I want to speak a little bit today about music and how Islam views music. This is just a sketch. There's a lot of detail. And one of the problems with the modern Muslim mind is, we want quick answers. What does Islam say about this? What does Islam say about that? Haram, halal, halal, haram, quick. But most issues, they need an introduction. So this is an introduction, to this topic. How did Muslims, our forefathers, our foremothers, how did the Salaf look and understand music? Music, Islamically, was always understood as a function of mathematics. So the study of music was understood as a sub-subject under mathematics. And even in medieval Europe, there were two core teachings, two core curricula. The first was called the trivium, the three subjects that people studied, which was logic, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then the quadrivium, the four subjects were considered mathematical subjects: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And of course, they took all of this from the Muslims. So this was in medieval Europe. This is when they started realizing they were falling behind. So they took these subjects and this category of learning from the Muslims. So music was understood from the time of Pythagoras all the way in time to the time of the Salaf as a function of music, as a function of math. Because when the ulama looked at music, they saw that music was nothing but different combinations of ratios of sounds. So the story, for example, of Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad, rahimahullah, who was one of the Salaf, he died in the year 174, if I'm not mistaken. He is the one that started to write about the different maqamat, the different modes of reciting Arabic poetry. And the story is that he was walking home one day and he was walking through the marketplace and he heard all of these sounds in the marketplace. By the way, this is the same story of Pythagoras, so maybe there's some overlap. But he heard the hammers and he heard the water dripping. And when he went home, he's like, all of those are ratios. Those are mathematical ratios. The ratios between sound and silence, sound and silence. So he started to articulate this understanding, which we study until today, the different maqamat, the different modes of how sound is expressed. So the study of music, which is itself understood from the study of mathematics, was always understood Islamically of how sound is expressed. It was all to service the spoken word, or the sung word in this case. So all of these poems that we have in Arabic, they're not like recited. They're not recited the way you recite Shakespeare, but they were sung. So when you read these poems, they have to be balanced in a certain meter, in a certain meter of how the line of poetry sounds. And then therefore, if you recite it with a certain tone and inflection, with these ratios, you get something that's beautiful. And the point of this study was not only to make the recitation of the poetry, and then by extension the recitation of the Quran itself, was not only to make that recitation sound good, but it was also to convey a certain emotion. So some of the maqams, some of the modes of music in Islam are happy. Some of them are sad. Some of them talk about loss, convey loss. Some of them talk, so for example, the mu'adhin, as he gives the adhan for the fajr, he will recite the adhan in a mode that's like the beginning, that's like uplifting because it's the beginning of the day. But then when that same mu'adhin will give the adhan for maghrib or isha, it will be we're winding down the end of the day. So when you come to the verses of Jannah, you're going to use a mode that expresses paradise. But when you have a verse that talks about the punishment of the hellfire, may Allah protect us from it, inshallah, you'll have a mode of expression of sound that reflects that. Right? This is what the Salaf were busy with. Keep that in mind. But this is all I'm saying. This is the Salaf. This is in the first 3-4 centuries of Islam. This is the kind of things that they were talking about. And then we have somebody like Al-Farabi, the great Islamic philosopher, who wrote Kitab al-Musiqa al-Kabir, the big book of music. So over 1,000 pages of talking about how music is constructed, the mathematical ratio between the notes and silence, the type of instruments that can project these notes. So that's the thing, is that the instruments that the Muslims invented, and they're, the oud, these are all Muslim inventions, the instruments that were invented in the classical period of Islam were instruments, tools used to express these different notes so you can hear how they sound. So for example, you find many of the huffaz of the Quran, many people that recite the Quran, they also play the oud. Why? Because they want to learn how this maqam is supposed to sound. So when I come to recite these verses, I can recite them in a way that sounds appropriate for what Allah Ta'ala is intending. So even if you don't understand the words, that emotion is conveyed. So the ulama understood that music was nothing other than articulating what we hear in nature. Why some sounds sound pleasant, and why some sounds maybe don't sound pleasant. Why when we have somebody that recites the Quran or recites poetry or sings, we enjoy it, and why we don't necessarily enjoy it. In other words, that this was something that was natural as 1 + 1 = 2. As natural as the square root of 9 is 3. So they also found that there's a ratio between the notes. Now, I'm not musically inclined, and obviously the khutbah is not appropriate to sing, but that's my excuse, but I can't really demonstrate, other than to say, for example, you have one connection of sounds, 10, 10, 10, but then you can add to that ta-ta-ten, 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 and then you can combine them, ta-ta-ten, 10, ta-ta-ten, 10, so on and so forth. And that's how the Salaf understood music. So much so that Western European took that as part of their core understanding. Now, what does the Sharia say about music and musical instruments? Because maybe you don't really care, that sounds all fancy, but what does the Quran and the Sunnah say about this topic? Because that might be interesting and all of that, but we read all of these hadith, you can go on YouTube and you can find a plethora of people yelling and screaming about that this is haram and so on and so forth. And that's what I think the takeaway for us is how is that understood by the people that looked at the Quran and the Sunnah and also understood the things that I'm talking about. So there are two principles that you have to understand before we understand what these hadith mean. The first principle, Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, he said when we have hadith that talk about the signs of Yawm al-Qiyamah, there are many hadith that talk about what will happen, what we call in the science of theology of Aqidah, as-sam'iyat, things that we hear from the Prophet ﷺ that we believe in. We haven't seen them or we haven't seen all of them, but we know there are signs and after we die we will see them, etc. All of those hadith, Imam al-Nawawi said, when the Prophet ﷺ gives us a sign of Yawm al-Qiyamah, there is no relationship between the Sharia ruling and that sign. So for example, the hadith of Jibreel that we all know about one of the signs of Yawm al-Qiyamah is that people will compete to build skyscrapers. So is it haram then to build a skyscraper? No, it's not haram. That's not, you don't glean that from the hadith, but rather the Prophet ﷺ was saying, by the way, this is a sign that when you see this, know that the hour is near. That's one principle. The second principle is that when there's a list of things in the Quran, in the Sunnah, they don't all take the same ruling. Al-iqtiran laysat bihujjah. That when things are mentioned back to back, it's not a proof that the ruling is the same. Allah Ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرْ بِالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرْ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. Allah commands here. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرْ. Allah commands justice. Justice is wajib. We have to have that. And ihsan. Okay, ihsan is not wajib, but it's something that we aim for. وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى, and keeping your family ties. That's something that's not wajib, but it's something that's permissible. So even in this verse, Allah Ta'ala lists 3 things. They don't all take the same ruling. So these 2 principles of interpretation, this is the difference between knowledge and people yelling, online. So we want to understand based on our principles of interpretation, how do we understand these verses So we go back to our question and say, what does Islam say about music, musical instruments, etc.? So the ulama, like Ibn Hazm, for example, he says the hadith that we find in Bukhari, no one disputes these hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said that one of the signs of Yawm al-Qiyamah is that people will approach in a plentiful way and will engage in zina, fornication, silk, singing, and musical instruments. This hadith is the hadith of Bukhari. So Ibn Hazm said, yeah, the Prophet ﷺ is describing the overall scene. When you find a scene like that, that's what's haram. But individually, silk women are able to use silk. And some of the Hanafis argued that men could use silk, but that's not the dominant position. The dominant position is that men don't use silk and silver, it's only for women. So right away, from that hadith, well, what does that mean? Well, zina, we know that's haram by consensus, but how about silk? So therefore, by extension, how about music and how about musical instruments? So Ibn Hazm, for example, rahimahullah, he argued that the Prophet ﷺ is talking about that scene. What we say today is the scene. Like if I go out clubbing or something like that, that scene, that's bad. Stay away from that. And when people do that, and they do that a lot, and they do that, and it's normal, and they do that, and they call it by different names, this is what the Prophet ﷺ is saying is a sign of Yawm al-Qiyamah. Now you can't take that hadith and then go to somebody, who's playing a melody in praise of the Prophet ﷺ, or talking about the Quran, or talking about love of God, or encouraging the troops as troops are going into war and into battle, and say that that's haram. They're two completely opposite things. So this is the difference between people who know and people who don't know, meaning that when we approach the Quran and the Sunnah, we want to understand these things in their context. So Ibn Hazm was just one, but people like Imam al-Ghazali, we've heard of him, right? Imam al-Ghazali is a guy we can trust. He said the same thing. But then there are others that no one's heard of, and that's part of the problem. Like Abdul Ghani Nabulsi, the great Syrian scholar who's buried in Damascus, Hanafi Mujtahid. He wrote a whole book about music and musical instruments. Al-Qaisarani, who himself was a hadith scholar, who wrote a book, Kitab al-Sama', a book about music. Now, are these people that we hear all the time? We probably never, this is the first time you ever hear these names. And that's one of the problems. The problems is that we have to look at what the Salaf, what our forefathers and what they were engaged with. They were engaged in building a civilization. How do you have a civilization without music? How do you have a civilization without the arts? Shaykh al-Islam Hassan al-Attar, who was Shaykh al-Azhar in the first half of the 19th century, he said, if you hear a melody and see a beautiful scene and do not see in that is beauty, then you have the life of a donkey. Because in Arabic, in ashjar, himar, it all rhymes. But his idea was, this is so basic. How could you hear something? How could you hear Bach's cello music or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and not say subhanallah? That's what he's saying in our language. How could you hear that and not be floored? That's unbelievable. How could you hear Mozart and not hear that that's genius? Because it goes back to the understanding of where music comes from, that it is these ratios of sounds. Just like the eye appreciates the calligraphy and the proportions of the writing, which we've said in previous talks is also a function of mathematics. Ibn al-Muqla, the saying is that Ibn al-Muqla was inspired with the art of calligraphy the way that the bee was inspired with the honeycomb. So Ibn al-Muqla, when he said the Arabic script must be written in a certain proportion to bring out the beauty of the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was to service the Quran. The art of calligraphy, this is where it comes from. How can you see that and not appreciate beauty? Likewise, how could you not hear a beautiful song or a beautiful melody and not be moved by it? We are moved by it all the time. And you are surrounded by music all the time. If you're in public spaces, you're in an elevator, you're waiting on the phone, you're on the plane, you're on the train, you're in the car. So we can't act like, astaghfirullah, that type of thinking is sick. It's not going to get us anywhere. Look at Al-Farabi. He lived in the 4th century of Islam. And he was talking about notes and musical instruments. Technically, this is the period of the Salaf, the first 5 centuries of Islam. Imam al-Ghazali, who we call Hujjat. Every Muslim is like, Imam al-Ghazalis are here. If only we had Imam al-Ghazali again. Like, if only we had Salah ad-Din again. We say those things, but look at what those people did. So the sum total of their understanding is that music, musical instruments, the whole thing, حَسَنُهُ حَسَنٌ وَقَبِيحُهُ قَبِيحٌ. The good of it is good and the bad of it is bad. Meaning if we have music, lyrics, songs that encourage, that motivate, that draw us nearer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's good. And if we have the same that does something else, then it's haram. Just like if you read a story or you read a poem and that poem made you, you know what, I'm going to go do something haram. Yeah, I read that poem. Then don't read that poem. It's not good for you. But maybe you read the same poem and it's written by, somebody else. It's written by Whitman or Keats or something like that. And you're like, Allah, this is unbelievable. I can't believe, look how he expressed it. And you fall in love with that phrase. Good, that's good for your iman. Right? This is al-hikmatu dalat al-mu'min. Wisdom is the lost property of the believer, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How about Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and music? We know that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he loved the good sound. When Abdullah bin Zayd rahimahullah radiallahu anhu dreamt of the adhan, he said, teach it to Bilal because he has a better voice. Even though Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu anhu could not pronounce all of the words correctly because he was originally not an Arab, but the Prophet ﷺ said that his voice trumps that. Teach the adhan to Bilal because he has a beautiful voice. The hadith of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari radiallahu anhu, the Prophet ﷺ, he heard him reading Quran, he's like, you have been given your voice is like the Psalms of David. Al-Mazamir, your voice is so beautiful, it's like prophetic. The Prophet ﷺ is saying this to Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. He's reciting the same Quran that we recite, but he appreciated the good voice. The hadith of the day of Bu'ath, the day in which the Medina Muslims celebrated their victory of a battle that took place in the Jahiliyyah. There was music and singing and dancing in the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ partook in that. And then over almost 300 Sahaba sang praises of the Prophet ﷺ in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. Like Hassan ibn Thabit. And when Hassan ibn Thabit would rhyme, he was like the poet laureate of Medina. When he would rhyme, the Prophet ﷺ said, continue, the spirit of in the Ruh al-Qudus ma'ak. That the spirit which Allah has created is going to guide you and protect you. That's a big endorsement. By the way, if the Prophet ﷺ says that to you, then that's going to encourage you to do more. Okay? And when Ka'b ibn Zuhair, he came and he had wronged the Prophet ﷺ and he came for his tawbah, he came to the mosque and he began his poem, Banat Su'ad. This has nothing to do with the poem. This is like an intro. That I had a woman named Su'ad and she left me, so now my heart is sad. The beginning of the poem, al-Ghazal we call it in Arabic, the Prophet ﷺ was so impressed, so happy that he took off his cloak and he gave it to him. And this poem, when we study it today, is called Qasidatul Burda. This is the original Qasidatul Burda. We're not talking about the Salaf, we are talking about Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He appreciated the beautiful voice. The Sahaba sang in the mosque. Singing in the mosque is a sunnah. There's no exaggeration, it's a sunnah. Singing praises of Allah and praises of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the mosque is a sunnah. This is what happened in the mosque of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right, so this is what the Quran and the Sunnah tell us about these things. So in the age in which we live in the environment in which we live in, we need to remember this argument of the place that music has. Because we need this revival of the lost arts that we had in our community. We need this for ourselves and we need this for our children. It can't just be always lessons and the Shaykh reading the Quran and studying the rulings of wudu. You're going to get too tired of that stuff. In our classes, when we would have like a public class on the weekend in Azhar, there would be munshideen, people that do inshad. They would come to the mosque and they would sing. And that was sort of our break from learning all of the dry stuff. And all that did is encourage us to want to learn more. And we would remember all of these stories. Remember the stories of the Sahaba. Remember the stories of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Remember the importance of the arts, the importance of the beautiful voice, the importance of beauty itself in Islam. Allahu Jameelun yuhibbul jamal. Allah is beauty and He loves beauty. So how can you see beauty and not appreciate it? Then therefore you are rejecting something that Allah Ta'ala has created. Just a sketch, something for us to think and reflect on. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. Next khutbah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So the upshot of the music discussion is that one sentence. حسنه حسن وقبيحه قبيح. The good of it is halal and the bad of it is haram. Same thing for poetry, same thing for all the arts. This is the perspective of the ulama towards the arts in general, specifically in our discussion, music. We talked about the hadith, that of course we accept, no one rejects these hadith, and we talked about how these hadith need to be interpreted with these two rules. The first rule is that the signs of Yawm al-Qiyamah do not necessarily take a certain ruling of the Sharia, but rather the Prophet ﷺ is telling us when this happens, this is a sign. And the second perspective is that when things are listed in the hadith or in the Quran, they don't necessarily take all of the same rulings. And in the hadith, therefore, using these principles of interpretation, these hadith that talk about the proliferation of music and musical instruments, the Prophet ﷺ is talking about that scene. When that scene is bad, then that's what's haram. And that we have a use for it in our tradition, inshallah. Before the dua, a few announcements. We're praying for the safe return of Brother Muhammad, Uthman Ahmed. He's been missing for some time. We're also praying for Hanif Sultan, who passed away. He is the brother of Brother Arif, who's part of the ICCP community. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy on those who've passed and to heal those who are sick, inshallah. My class tonight will be at 7:30, that's normal, and there'll be no halaqah on Sunday. And there's a college application workshop, 2 to 5 on Sunday, October the 6th. So Sunday, October the 6th, 2 to 5, college application workshop for those interested, inshallah. That being said, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this final moment of Jumu'ah prayer, we ask Him with our hearts turned to Him, may He forgive us our sins, inshallah. May He help us overcome our shortcomings. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us, to bless our families. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us deep, insightful knowledge of His book and of the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us people of beauty, to make our homes homes of beauty, to make our masajid of beauty, and to make our relationships of beauty. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to resurrect us with those who are beautiful and those who are kind and merciful. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase our faith and make it grow. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His mercy on those who have passed before us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless our parents, to protect our children, to protect our mosque, and to help our businesses flourish. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all of this, and we know He is able. فَاللَّهُمَّ اهْدِنَا فِيمَنْ هَدَيْتَ اللهم عافنا فيمن عافيت وتولنا فيمن توليت اللهم بارك لنا فيما أعطيت وقنا واصرف عنا شر ما قضيت اللهم انقلنا من دائرة سخطك إلى دائرة رضاك وافتح علينا فتوح العارفين بك واحشرنا تحت لواء نبيك صلى الله عليه وسلم يوم القيامة اللهم اسقنا من يده الشريفة شربة ماء لا نظمأ بعدها أبدا ثم أدخلنا الجنة بغير حساب ولا سابقة عقاب ولا عتاب ومتعنا بالنظر إلى وجهك الكريم في جنات الخلد يا رحيم اللهم ارحم حينا وميتنا وحاضرنا وغائبنا وارفع أيدي الأمم عنا وأقمنا بالحق وأقم الحق بنا وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وأقم الصلاة إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت
لا إله إلا الله سيدنا محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. استقيموا ورحمة الله. Straighten the lines. صلوا صلاة المودع. Praise if this is your last prayer. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لإيلاف قريش إيلافهم رحلة الشتاء والصيف فليعبدوا رب هذا البيت الذي أطعمهم من جوع وآمنهم من خوف. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. We found a golden bangle in the women's restroom. So Brother Riel has it. It's yours. And if it's not, if no one claims it, we're going to auction it. I think we're starting at $50,000.